This is John Jackson Miller. I am the curator and founder of Comichron.com, the world's largest public database of comic book sales figures. And I'm often asked about what the peak month for the comics industry was in terms of dollars as opposed to units, the amount of money that the business brought in. And people often assume that month would have been back in the 1940s or 50s, back when comics were much more of a mass medium sold in newsstand outlets everywhere. In point of fact, it's actually much later. April 1993 is the top month for the comics industry, regardless of whether you look at inflation or not. Even if you adjust for inflation, there was more money in the market in April 1993 than at any previous or later time in the comics industry. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is a comic book, which ought to be familiar to many collectors out there. This is Adventures of Superman number 500. It shipped to retailers on April 13th, 1993. It just happens that I am recording this on April 13th, 2018, so this is the 25th anniversary of this book's release. And it went on sale on the 14th in many stores and the 15th in a lot of stores as well. So it was a pretty important comic book in the history of the business. However, I have to admit, this cover is unfamiliar to me and until now. And one of the reasons that it's unfamiliar is the version of this comic book I read was the newsstand edition, which was distinct from the collector's edition by this cover, and also by the fact that it did not come wrapped in a bag, which is how the actual collector's edition of Adventures of Superman 500 shipped. There was a reason that they did that. It was to bring to mind another comic book which had come out just 4 or 5 months earlier in November of 1992. That's Superman 75. That's the comic book where they killed Superman. And, of course, everyone who had been in comics for any amount of time knew that Superman was probably going to get better one day. That was Len Wein, the creator of Wolverine and so many other great characters. He used to have a law that said in comics nobody's ever dead unless you can see the body, and usually not even then. People outside the comics industry, however, had not heard of this. So when in November of 1992, in a very slow news week following the election that year, people found out that Superman was going to die in an upcoming comic book, they flocked to stores. The day that the comic book came out is regarded as the single biggest day in the history of comics. It was a $30 million day by the best estimates that we have. When people couldn't get Superman 75, and of course they were willing to pay amounts quite a lot more than cover price for it, people would buy anything else that wasn't nailed down in the store. So that was quite a lot of money to bring in at that time. The first Batman movie had just come out 3 years earlier, and its opening weekend had been in the 40 million range. So $30 million for a bunch of comic shops was pretty significant. So DC was looking in 1993 to continue the story and to pick up some market share after what had happened in 1992 when Image split off from Marvel, the Image creators at Marvel went off to start their own publishing company. There was a month in there where DC actually was in third place. And that was certainly an unusual position for the company to be in. The writers of the various Superman comic series as well were looking to figure out how to interlace the story that had been begun in Superman 75, or actually before that, through all of the different titles that were coming out weekly for Superman. And Mike Carlin, the editor of the line, realizing that he had strong story possibilities from the 4 monthly teams, decided that the way to go was to basically let all four teams try their own version of how Superman would come back from the dead. So there's a storyline in Action Comics with one version of Superman. There is another storyline in just the main Superman title. The Man of Tomorrow was that version. We have the Metropolis Kid, Superboy returning in Adventures of Superman. And then we had the Man of Steel. Steel, of course, is another character in the Reign of the Supermen, as they called it. And all of these comics, two Adventures Superman issues, and then these other three comics, were all slated to come out in April of 1993. And this was something that was obviously of great interest to the distributors at the time. And I say distributors plural because in those days we had comics distributors in the double digits. The main ones that you can see here. Diamond, obviously the distributor that we're almost familiar with. Capital, which was its largest competitor. Heroes World, which later on would become part of Marvel. But there were also, other regional distributors like Friendly Franks, Comics Hawaii, Hobby Game, Comics Unlimited, and then Andromeda, Multibook, and Styx were all active up in Canada. And all of these distributors were very interested in carrying these titles with regard to Superman. So, April 1993, we have a situation where there are a lot of distributors. These distributors have helped to open up a record large number of comic shops, often on fairly easy credit terms, if you want to call it that. We have a lot of collectors in the market. We have a lot of interest from retailers and collectors in the output of what is now a very large number of publishers that has sprung up to serve these stores and these collectors. And we have, in The Return of Superman, an event that we know is going to be big, as opposed to The Death of Superman, which we sort of knew was going to be big, and some of the previous events that had happened. This was something where everybody was pretty sure this was going to be a big month. How big? Well, let's look at the numbers. This is Comichron, the website page for April of 1993, relating to what Diamond Comic Distributors sold. I only have the Diamond page up, and really for 1993 at this point, I have yet to get the other months up online, but those other months will be online in the near future. One of the things that I did here is I added estimated unit sales for each title, and we'll get into these shortly. I generally don't, when it comes to this period of distribution where there's multiple different distributors, because there's really no way to know what every distributor sold. We can only sort of estimate. But we know enough data points from the publishers themselves and on individual titles that we can kind of make some guesses here. And so what you'll find if you look at this page is the top five very clearly are the top five Superman releases. The number one book was Adventures of Superman 500, the collector's edition, and then Adventures 501 appears as the number 4 book. The other 3 Reign of Superman books with the die-cut covers also make the top 5. And it is significant that DC, according to Diamond, this was only the second time that DC had led the market shares in the direct market period in the whole time that Diamond had been around. The previous time was the end of 1989 when the Batman movie was big, and we had the Legends of the Dark Knight title come out with its 4 different covers. That was the previous time that DC had been in the lead. But by the time we get to the Return of Superman, as I say, we have a case where retailers were ordering by the case. They were ordering by the multiple case. I know, there's a report that a retailer in Chicago ordered 5 times as many copies of Adventures 500 than he had ordered of Superman 75. Possibly the assumption was he wouldn't get the copies, that they would be allocated. They all showed up. Everything showed up, and so the total figure that we have for the individual titles. Adventures ends up getting double the sales of the other 4 books that were part of that promotion that month. These figures are very rough estimates based on some known data points that are further down the list, and also, more importantly, an overall data point which we have, which is that it is fairly well established from other sources that I have that 48 million comics were bought in the direct market or were pre-ordered by retailers in the month. The top 300, as I have figured it here, accounts for about 45 million of it. Now, 48 million comics is huge. 99 million comics was the number of comics shipped to the direct market in 2017, and that was a multi-year high. Well, this was 48 million comics in 1 month. And those comics, we know, sold for an average of $2.16 each. Now, even though we're still back in the period where you could find comics at less than $2. There are comics at $1.50. There are comics at $1.25 even. Even though the comics were cheaper then, the bulk of the comics that were ordered were more expensive. And so, we have an average value of $2.16 at 48 million copies. That puts the overall amount of material out there at more than $100 million. More than $100 million in a month would be bigger than any month of the 1950s. They would have to have sold 2 billion comics in a month at 10 cents each to meet that figure in an inflation-adjusted terms from the 50s to 1993. No one that I know believes that there was ever a month in the 50s where you had 2 billion comics sold. That's unlikely. 1 billion, is a very possible number. Beyond that, I think it's difficult to say that there is a month that either tops this one in terms of dollars spent. Or in terms of in recent years, certainly nothing has come close in terms of unit sales. 48 million in a month is gargantuan, and you'll notice that it's not just DC. We see Turok, Dinosaur Hunter #1 coming in at certainly more than 1 million copies. It's possible, depending on how the estimates worked out, that Deathblow at Image was also over 1 million. Once you count all the distributors together, and again, this is something to keep in mind. These index numbers are just plain Diamond. What they mean is that for every 100 copies of Amazing Spider-Man they sold, because that's the key title, they sold 389 Turoks. Or they sold 857 Adventures of Superman 500s. We don't know all of the other distributors, but again, we are sort of making educated guesses here. Again, these are really large numbers. I mean, Turok over 1 million. Turok is one of the titles that we have the statements of ownership for the entire series. In the 1960s and 1970s, Turok never saw over 400 and some odd thousand, and that was when there were a lot more, theoretically a lot more, people out there buying. This is definitely a high water mark for a lot of different publishers. Marvel, yeah, it's worth noting, is kind of not in the top 17, 18th place. I think we get to our first Marvel here, X-Men Unlimited 1, which has a sell-in of around 500,000 copies. Marvel has in the top 300 106 comics, which wasn't even all of them. This was a period where there were a lot of comics coming out from a lot of different publishers. Dark Horse, third largest publisher in terms of number of releases. Malibu, Image was still sort of ramping up. Valiant was very big at the time. And we also had Topps, Neil Adams Company, Continuity was in there, and we have just so many books here. It's very likely that the number of comics above 100,000 copies, which is a benchmark these days, in April of '93 was close to somewhere in the 80s to 90s. I have here at 88. But we don't know exactly where it'll wind up, and so we're looking at some very large numbers again from this market that was artificially inflated. We had a bit of a credit bubble in terms of the number of stores, but certainly we also had the speculator attention that was out there. And people ask, well, we had a $30 million day in November of '92 with Death of Superman. Did we have a $30 million day or larger this time with that 100 million that was out there? It's hard to know. I kind of think probably not. And one of the reasons is that something else was happening when this came out. Because the publishers had transitioned from a Thursday New Comics Day to a Wednesday New Comics Day, and so, for example, the DC, I know Mike Carlin has joked about the book coming out slated for, Adventures of Superman 500 being slated for April 15th, which is tax day in the United States, so that with Superman coming back to life, only taxes out of Death and Taxes is still a constant. Well, the book actually landed in places, shipping on Tuesday, or beginning to arrive on Tuesday. Wednesday was really the on sale date for a lot more places. That's the 14th, and so it sort of gets spread out a bit more. I'm presuming that we didn't hit 30 million in one day, but it's difficult to say. And again, of course, these comics that we're seeing here are over across the entire month, not just 1 week. We have here, this goes down to 300th place, and you'll see a lot of names that aren't around anymore in comics. Innovation, Comico, Russ Cochran, which was doing the EC reprints, which later on were done by Gemstone. Kitchen Sink, and Caliber. Although I think Caliber actually has returned in some way, shape, or form in more recent years here. And there are a few comics that I was able to get some data for that appear after 300th place. And then finally, we have the graphic novels. Diamond in this era did not publish units or order index numbers for the comics, for the graphic novels rather, and so it's interesting. The numbers here at this time were just not that big, but even so, you can add to that. To the money that we were made from comics that month, this all gets added on top of that, and it's one of the reasons why we believe that the year of 1993 probably was in the $850 million range overall, and the one thing that we simply didn't know at this point, although there were certainly some warning signs and people warning about it. Comics Buyer's Guide had run an editorial, urging new publishers not to publish anything or not to hop into the market yet, or at that moment, because it was so glutted. By the end of 1993, it was pretty apparent that this month of April was the peak month for the market. We hit the first month of 1994, January, with the collapse well underway. It's believed that 1,000 accounts closed in January of 1994, it just by the end of the year, by the end of '94. That was when Marvel purchased Heroes World Distribution, intending to sort of cut out the middleman, and that ended up, lengthening by several years. I believe the amount of time that that it took to recover, even partially from what happened here, because by the time you got to the end of 1997. There was only one distributor left carrying all the comics in the market, and that was Diamond. This is a section of the website that I do intend to continue expanding on. This was a specific, interesting past month that I wanted to sort of skip back to and add the data that I had available for it. But I'll be filling in the rest of 93 and 94, and of course everything from 95 onward is already on the site, and there are a lot more data sets that I expect to put up in the future, as well as some more videos looking at some of these interesting moments in the history of comics. So that is April 1993, the peak year for the comics industry in dollar terms. I am John Jackson Miller, Comichron.com. Until next time, I'll see you in the comic shop.